I'll remind everyone we are recording the meeting as we have been for the last 2 or 3 meetings, and I've been posting those after a couple of days to kind of get it downloaded and cleaned up. We then put that on the POTS website, which you all can find at POET's website at pacificoceanenergy.org, and scroll all the way to the bottom. You'll see 3 acronyms at the very bottom, one of which is POTS. Just click on that and it'll take you to the website. And there you can see the past recordings, and we're going to start populating that increasingly with interesting documents and maps. You know, as we produce more work product, we'll post that on that site, so you always can use that as a resource. And if you all find something that you think is relevant to the topic of transmission and offshore wind, feel free to send that to me or Bill, and we'll post that on there as well. All right.
I was a little bit late, Jason. Can you repeat what you need on transmission?
Oh, welcome, Talia. I just wanted to remind folks that we have a website for POTS for this group, Pacific Offshore Wind Transmission Solutions Work Group, and you can find that at POET's website, pacificoceanenergy.org. Go scroll all the way to the bottom, and you'll see 3 acronyms, one of which is POTS. You can click on that and you'll find the website for this group, and we're posting materials there. And I was just saying that if you all have something you think is relevant or interesting to the topic of transmission, feel free to send it to us and we'll post it on there for folks. And I see that Travis just joined us. Welcome, Travis.
Thank you.
There you go.
Hello there, Jason.
Welcome. All right, we're 4 minutes in already. Let's plan to launch this thing here very promptly. I'll keep admitting folks, but I don't want to hold us up too much. So I'm not going to say much at all here. You all know the plan briefly. This is the Pacific Offshore Transmission Solutions Work Group. It's basically a whole think tank that POET has pulled together in order to conceive of and socialize potential transmission solutions for maximizing the amount of floating offshore wind that can be developed more or less in the area of Northern California and Southern Oregon. I believe that's pretty much our area of focus. Of course, we recognize by focusing on that we're somebody have something? Sorry. Focusing on that area, that means we're excluding other areas. We get it. And that's a topic that we've been discussing. So with that, I just want to remind everyone that Friday from 9 to 3, I think it is, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management will be hosting its Oregon Task Force meeting, and they will be announcing their draft call areas. This, of course, is a very exciting development. It is a very public evidence of the formal federal process by which wind energy lease areas are identified. So essentially, the horse is out of the barn here with the call areas. The process has started, and it'll be very interesting to see where those sites are, and we'll know a lot more after Friday. And so hopefully this will make it all the more real and relevant for everyone involved in the conversation when they realize that these leases are moving. So it's getting very real quickly, and I expect to see some more public comment about this process, both support and opposition. It's how it is, but it is exciting, and makes what we're doing here all the more relevant. So with that, I'm going to stop here and hand it over to Bill Henry and let him get the day launched. Bill, it's all yours.
Well, thanks, Jason. So on the agenda today is we're going to have, so typically when we structure these meetings, we've got 2 different components, a learning session and then a discussion. session. So we'll have the first presentation from Travis DeVille from PNNL to discuss the study that they have underway. And then we'll have discussion about that. And then following that, we'll go into a discussion component where I'll give an overview of this POTS or the structure that we have at the steering committee, and then 2 subcommittees to dive into some other topics in a little bit more depth. And we'll just have that as an introduction. And also it's going to be a pitch to engage new participants in these committees. So we want you to be thinking about the ability and interest in providing some substantive input and time in the future as this initiative moves forward. So with that, I'll hand it over to Travis, and you've got until approximately the end of the hour if we need that time to go through the presentation and discussion.
Okay, great. Thanks, Bill. And I'm putting my slides into presentation mode.
We can
And I'm
see
going to
it.
flip to the
Looking
first
good.
slide and make sure that it flipped. Did you guys see slide 2 there?
Yes, looking good.
I've had that get me in the last couple meetings, so I want to be sure. Thanks. And I should say that Mark is here, and Mark actually is going to give most of this presentation today. Also want to acknowledge Drew Bhatnagar is also on the call. So the 3 of us, Daniel's not on this call, but helped put this together as well. And Mark and Drew and I are the ones kind of running this study for the full duration. So I'll just make a few comments as to the study, and then I'll pass it off to Mark. And then hopefully we can, really we're looking for feedback from this group on some of this work, this early work we've done. And we would love it if, hopefully Mark doesn't mind, I haven't really run this by him, but if you would just jump in. I mean, I guess we have, solid 50 minutes if we need it, and we'd love to have a discussion on some of these things we've done. And I know we're kind of hitting you with it without you seeing it ahead of time. So we'll go slow, and we'd love to take your questions to clarify anything we've done so far. Just quickly, so I'm Travis DeVille. I'm a project manager and energy systems research engineer with Pacific Northwest National Laboratory. I'm based in Portland, Oregon. I've done some offshore wind techno-economic evaluation, and particularly around grid integration. And that's my background in the utility scale wind industry in the United States and Canada. And I'm also on a detail right now directly to this is my only project really at the laboratory. And I'm on a detail the rest of my time directly to the Department of Energy, supporting Jocelyn Brown Saraceno on a White House commissioned joined Department of Energy and Department of Interior team that is focused on identifying new approaches to facilitate offshore wind systems integration with a first eye on the Atlantic coast, but then not so far off. We'll be looking here out west. So we'd love to take questions on that later if that's of interest to anyone as well. So just one slide on the project, because I know folks may have heard bits and pieces. I just wanted to make sure we pause for a second and give you a very quick overview of this project. It's funded by the National Offshore Wind Research and Development Consortium for 18 months, starting at the beginning of this year. Basically, we're focusing on developing a strategy for maximization of electrical system benefits. So think of contributions to reliable and resilient electricity supply within the frame of future decarbonization goals and standards that are coming out of the legislatures now at the state level, and folks are, I'm sure, familiar with here. We're really focusing on this little inset map here in the upper right. Really from the kind of Coos Bay, roughly Coos Bay. It's not really a cutoff, but rough guidance is focused Coos Bay down to Humboldt Bay, Eureka, California area, where the capacity credit is strong of this resource, in addition to the very high capacity factors. We know that those, and some of these come out of these great maps from NREL that showed me wind speeds to be quite high there. I know this group knows all this stuff already, so I don't need to spend a lot of time talking about it. Mark and others on our team have considered and Mark has done some past work on considering different, transmission solutions to move some of the offshore wind that could be generated from the Humboldt wind energy area. And that kind of work is very much relevant to what we're trying to do. We'd like to optimize, a generation footprint in this zone that I'm kind of showing here. Again, this is kind of the orange area in this inset map is cut off to the west by a 1,300 meter bathymetric contour in terms of sea depth, and then to the east, the federal state ocean boundary, water boundary. And then we're looking, so we'll be carving out, kind of an optimum footprint in terms of overall value to the electricity supply and transmission systems, up to say maybe it's a 7 gigawatt or 10 gigawatt cap, looking at what the states are talking about right now. And then once we have that optimized, we'll move to evaluating conceptual transmission scenarios. And those scenarios were really, they haven't been chosen yet. These 3 bullets indicate, I guess, the set that they could be drawn from, or it could be combinations of these things. Really, we'll be looking to groups such as this one that's on this call to help us pick the 3, to kind of whittle down to 3 of the most promising scenarios to take this generation footprint to onshore grids. So we're really leaning on Pode and all of you for that, and we really appreciate your engagement, your questions today and in future sessions. So you're an important piece of this study, even if you just heard about it. And then of course, I haven't mentioned this maybe explicitly in this slide, but hopefully others have heard this. BOEM, the Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, then funded an extension of this work to consider power flows into San Francisco. So that's another piece of this that will be interwoven into this project over the next, well, now I guess we're closer to 16 months, but these are the key outcomes. So we're really driving towards a system valuation methodology, and that is what is the content of the material that we will discuss this morning, and which Mark will step us through shortly. We want to propose a valuation methodology that tries to capture holistically, but also bounded to the electricity system, a range of contributions. Well, I should say impacts, which are values net of costs. So they could be incurred or avoided costs, direct contributions, or contributions that are required from other generation to help balance offshore wind. This is an unbiased approach, but evaluation that should help us indicate relative value of one scenario over another. And then we're going to be, kind of the bedrock of the study are these system dispatch and power flow simulations, similar to work that Drew and I did and others have done also in the Oregon context and in California, I should say. But we'll be looking at a different footprint and different transmission concepts to really scrub the dispatch, the impacts to dispatch across the Western interconnection. And then we'll do some detailed power flow work as well, of course, into San Francisco. But we'd also like to study, system stability type issues at the points of interconnection to the extent we can fit that in. That can take a lot of hours. So, but it's of interest to us to check that. And then we have a feedback loop where we say, okay, based on that analysis work and application through the system valuation methodology, is there anything that the methodology is missing? Is there anything that needs to be valued in a different way? Are there any elements of these scenarios that are not completely characterized? And so we kind of loop back around to kind of make sure that the valuation methodology is solid and it can be used in the future by others for electricity system values. So that's why this methodology is so important. It's really fundamental to the project. So we've done some work. Mark and Dan have really led that off. They've done some work to develop this methodology, and Mark's going to present that today. So without further ado, Mark, would you mind taking it from here?
Sure, Travis. So thanks for the intro on the project, and this slide just shows what we're talking about today. So first, why are we valuing offshore wind, and why are we using this system-wide approach? What are the elements that create the value stack for impacts or benefits to the electrical system? What are the methods we can use to quantify those values? And then lastly, what portions are kind of outside the scope of the study, or what values are not included at the final metrics. So we can go to the next slide and just talk about why do we want to assign value in this particular way. So as you all know, offshore wind's expected to grow, and offshore wind is just a different resource than we've seen with distributed renewables and other smaller scale renewables that have integrated to the grid. And it presents a separate and different challenge for grid integration, and in particular for electricity system management, having a large injection of power at a particular point at a coastal substation, which has not traditionally been designed for accepting these large amounts of power. So traditional metrics that we're familiar with and that you all are familiar with might be levelized cost of energy, or levelized avoided cost of energy. And these metrics in particular really look at the impacts to a developer. So what sorts of costs and profits are accrued for a developer for a particular project. So it says, how does this project fare relative to other projects, whether those are offshore wind or other generation sources? And so instead of just taking a narrow scope and saying, how does this project perform within its own boundaries, we want to look more broadly at how does this project impact or benefit the electricity system as a whole. So this is what we're calling a system-wide approach. And in order to do that, we need to expand beyond the traditional value streams of energy and capacity and look at more impacts, which include regulating reserves, air emissions, transmission, upgrade deferrals, congestion, and other pieces that we'll walk through in the next slides. So how we really envision starting this project, creating the methodology is to start with the value stack. And so this is a very important piece of understanding system-wide valuation is what components are you including to understand the impacts or the costs. So offshore wind, for example, may be able to provide regulating reserves to meet or address changes in frequency on the electricity system. But offshore wind may also, while they may be able to provide it, they also may require more regulating reserves to be provided by other generators. So these are the pieces that we're trying to include, whether they're positive or negative. So this value stack kind of highlights all the different components and does a good job to kind of categorize them. So we have primary services, energy and capacity. We have grid support services shown in orange, and we'll walk through each one of these in some detail later. In yellow, we have impacts to the transmission system. This could be either congestion relief or congestion creation, expansion costs or upgrade deferrals. We have in green service continuity, and so this is what we're highlighting as reliability and resilience benefits. We have environmental or air pollution, which includes both criteria air pollutants and greenhouse gas emissions. And the last piece in purple is just financial risk for developers that can be included here. So collectively, these value components represent the benefits of an offshore wind project to the electrical system. And this is what we're trying to capture as in the methodology. Some other benefits may accrue that are considered outside the scope of this study, and those are like societal effects, whether it's economic development, job creation, impacts to tourism, and things like that. But we're really focused more on like the electrical grid side of things, and so that little gray box down on the side is just considered outside of our scope here. Thanks. So these next slides are just going to walk through the different services or different pieces of the value stack. If you have questions, you can just hop in, drop in the chat, raise your hand, somehow let me know that someone wants to talk. So primary services, this is what we're most familiar with when we think about generators. That's energy, the ability to provide kilowatt hours or megawatt hours that serve those energy needs of the users. And this is determined by locational marginal prices. So this is both time dependent and location dependent. The value, the cost or value of energy changes both the time of day that it's needed to be used and then the location at which it needs to be used. The second primary service is capacity. And so this is really the amount of firm generation that a project can provide. And this allows the system operator to know if and predict, are we able to meet the expected demand for that day? And if so, do we have the generation capacity to do it? And how do we do it? So the market value of capacity is typically found through its capacity credit, which is then converted into a capacity value. And some ISOs or RTOs have mechanisms to provide financial support for generators that provide capacity as a market product. And we can go to the next slide. The next category of value components we're talking about are grid support services. So these include things to help support and maintain system frequency, system voltage, and start generators and the system back up after an outage. So frequency response is the main task for transmission operators to maintain, to keep frequency at the right level. And so there's many time scales and many ways in order to do that, starting from a short time scale in terms of milliseconds to longer time scales of minutes and hours to help match the load directly with the demand. So starting kind of at the top, where it's mostly just looking at different time scales of frequency support. So the first category, which we're calling frequency response, this helps regulate system voltage, typically and traditionally using the rotating inertia from synchronous generators. However, that's not the only way that the service can be provided. These are typically, these services are typically provided like in seconds to at least less than a minute to help support and maintain system frequency. It can often be done at a millisecond level, just naturally by the way a synchronous generator operates. So markets for this particular product are uncommon. It's just as part of like the traditional kind of synchronous generator heavy electrical system, these were inherent to the system. They would be able to ride through small frequency events just by the rotating inertia of a plant. So including this in the value stack is to understand whether offshore wind can provide this through power electronics available on the turbine, or if there's further impacts onto the system, which may require additional frequency response to meet those fluctuations on a second by second basis. The second item in the stack is regulating reserves. So these are market products that are called regulation up and regulation down. That basically means that generators can contract with the ISO or RTO managing the region to provide more or less energy when they get a signal from that grid operator. So these fluctuations typically occur on relatively short time scales, like in the order of maybe 30 seconds to I think maybe 3 minutes, where a grid operator will ask, you need to provide more, tell a generator you need to provide more power to maintain system frequency, or you need to drop your power to maintain system frequency. And those generators are compensated for those actions. Next is contingency reserves. These are both spinning and non-spinning reserves that can come online at short notice to provide additional power to meet mismatches in forecasted demand and actual demand, to make sure that the generation capacity is matching the load at every moment. So spinning reserves are typically available when they're called upon to provide additional power, and non-spinning reserves take generally 10 minutes to start up to provide any additional power. So again, this is included to see if offshore wind can provide these services or if it requires more services from other generators. Next is ramping reserves. And I guess I should say that spinning and non-spinning reserves are a typical market product that's used, and those generators are compensated for that additional value they're providing to the system. Next is ramping reserves. Ramping reserves are capacity that can be dispatched upwards or downwards to maintain system voltage and account for forecasting errors. An increase in non-dispatchable power generation, such as offshore wind, may require an expansion of ramping reserves. So that's why we want to make sure it's included in the value stack. Next is voltage support. Voltage support is provided when generators can provide or decrease the amount of reactive power that's provided to the grid. This service typically needs to occur on on a local level because reactive power can't be transmitted over long distances. And then the last component in this category is black start, which is the capability to start up a generation system without assistance from an external electricity grid. Usually this is used in response to a blackout. So just kind of as an overview, all of these are grid services that are used on a day-to-day basis in all operating areas. Most of them are currently market products in many ISOs and RTOs. The exception is the frequency response, which occurs on really short time scales. And now we can go on to the next slide.
Hey, Mark.
Yes, sorry.
I was wondering if we should this is a really dense slide. So I wonder if we could just pause for a second and make sure people have a chance to, if they wanted to ask a question, or if any of this wasn't clear.
Yeah.
It took us a while to put together. So we've had a lot of time to think about it, but others maybe have had less time.
Travis, this is Jason. I'll just expose my overt ignorance here and ask probably some dumb questions. So when you say there's a market for these various products, I mean, historically, some of these products were inherent in thermal generation, right? You didn't have to worry about, frequency response. You can just change the speed of your generator, spinning generator. Given that we have solar and other forms of generation, I understand that these are now products that need to be identified and provided and valued. Well, how does that actually happen? Where is the market, and how do companies think about that? If you're asking, when it's time for POET to put these proposals out to the industry at large, asking their input on the suite of potential values out there, how do companies actually think about the value of these? Where are the markets? How do they identify the value? How do they sell their product? Is that all well-established systems, or is that something that's in development?
That's a great question. I would say I'll take a first crack, and then Mark, maybe you want to have a shot too at that question. And I'm sure others are thinking about the answer as well. And they come from, especially if you're coming from industry. In my industry years, what I would say is there a lot of these things were required, or particularly frequency response and reactive power support. I mean, those were sort of just grid code kind of. We often would complain about that in industry because we were required to do these things, offer these services through our product as a kind of rules of interconnection or rules to play with the grid operator, but without compensation behind them. So frequency response is a great example in terms of, at least in terms of inertia, or what's typically been provided off of the synchronous rotating machines. It just kind of comes with the technology, and it's not necessarily something that's compensated for. But as now PFR, primary frequency response, there are some market products around those types of responses. And I would also say that as you get away from synchronous, I mean, this transition is happening now. I mean, we're not there yet, but other parts of the world, we mentioned Ireland there, where there's a significant amount of asynchronous response and less synchronous response. There is an emerging market that project developers are targeting. They're planning around for more of their offtake instead of all of it being energy or capacity. They're thinking about things like the value of frequency response. There are other there have been frequency response markets that have quickly been saturated, and PJM ran one. It does run one, and that was kind of quickly gobbled up years back. But I would say in general, we're thinking about any existing markets, like particularly, this valuation methodology is system agnostic, but we are, our first application will be here in the West in CAISO and across the grids in Oregon as well. And we're thinking through which markets exist now, which we can point to, but also which of these are underrepresenting what the future value will be. Some of these will change over time as the generation mix transitions. Black start. I mean, is there a market for black start? I'm not sure there's a market for black start off asynchronous generation right now. But is it valuable? Sure, it's valuable. Voltage support. I don't know that there's an existing market for that. Ramping reserves. This is more of a system valuation. So that part of this is that we're thinking beyond or kind of outside of the frame of an individual project, and we're thinking now at system scale, what are the impacts and what are the values associated with those impacts? And those could be negative values or costs. Same thing with contingency reserves. So Mark, let me stop talking, and if you'd like to fill anything I missed, that'd be great.
Sure, thanks. And I guess what I would just add to that is that when we say that there's market products for this, we mean that within ISO regions, they provide financial compensation to generators who provide the service. So at the California ISO, they have a broad category of ancillary services, which includes particularly items like regulating reserves up or down and contingency reserves. And it allows the independent system operator to communicate directly with the generator and say, we need this service to help support the grid. And then the generator has been tested and certified to provide that service. And then they provide the service and then get compensated for it. It's typically a small amount of value relative to energy and capacity, which are sold through the same or similar wholesale market. But in general, there's economic markets in place that are existing to wield both power capacity and services across a ISO or RTO range.
I did note that Shannon Souza had her hand up a little earlier. I think she took it down. Shannon, you got anything for us?
Hi there. Hey, everyone. Yes, I am just like doing cartwheels over here. This is perfect timing. And relative to Jason Bush's question, I'd also add that we are at a time of market valuation flux. In the state of Oregon at the PUC, we've been working on the capacity docket for some time. And we have been elevating the work that the national labs have been doing in this space as perfectly timely and exemplary of the kind of comprehensive valuation that can and should be done. I did have a question though. Are contingency reserves, is there a place for electrolysis there? And if not, is that considered elsewhere in your value stack?
Good question. Mark, you want to take it first?
Sure, and I think that it really gets at what's the additional benefit of storage capacity. So storage can be provided both through battery storage or, as you say, using electrolysis to convert electricity to hydrogen and then going back when you need it. It's a good question. I think ultimately whether we include storage as a scenario depends on the alternative. Like after we finish the framework, when we choose the scenarios, do we have a scenario that includes that option? Whether or not we have a scenario, this framework can apply to generation assets that also have storage. So storage just kind of expands the capabilities of a plant to provide energy when they need it. And so if you wanted to participate, as you say, in a contingency reserve for an offshore wind plant, that might require you to pre-curtail your energy production. And that's not something that may not be ideal in terms of economics, because you'd be reducing the amount of energy you're providing in hopes that they say, hey, can you turn up your power? And then you can turn it up to the full capacity. So having an ability to do storage, whether it's through electrolysis or batteries, you can have that energy set aside to participate as a spinning reserve. Travis, Drew, anything to add?
Just to add to that, I think, Shannon, the value that jumps out to me in terms of, something like hydrogen, long duration hydrogen storage would be on the capacity side. So I think like a resource adequacy type of, as opposed to a grid support service, more in the former slide that Mark just went through, where we talked about these primary services, capacity might be the one where, the ability to firm the offtake of power might be more valuable than trying to squeeze into one of these reserve products. But I guess we would learn that by building this methodology and then calibrating it to this context in Oregon, California.
That makes sense. Thanks, and excellent work.
Thanks, Shannon. So Jason, we have one comment I wanted to highlight from Fred, who has indicated that perhaps there's not much appetite for frequency response in the Northwest, given the massive amount in the hydropower system. So that's interesting feedback, and thank you for noting that, Fred. I don't know if you want to say anything else about that, but appreciate you putting that in the comments.
Yeah, this is Fred. Not to belabor this too much, but the Columbia River hydro system has, I don't know, at any given time, if you count both federal and non-federal dams, something like 10,000 megawatts operating typically, and a lot of inertia in those dams in the hydro system. But there are lots of other of these ancillary services where their ability to respond is pretty limited, actually. So, the addition of big new generation resources with inverters, which means wind, among others, is actually very helpful, because those can actually respond faster than even the fastest hydro, which is pretty fast, actually. Thermal resources are typically a lot slower. So, but there's lots of technical issues in making that happen, but it's very possible to do it.
Great, that's great feedback. Thank you so much. And then Bill notes that the Northwest is currently a seller of a frequency product to CAISO. And then I see one more comment coming in from Chip, citing the IEEE standard 2800 for fast frequency response, voltage regulation, and ride through. Yep. So is that a recent publication, Chip?
Yeah, it was published, I think, 2 weeks ago.
Okay.
I was on the committee that developed it.
Okay. Thank you, sir, for that. Maybe thanks a lot for speaking up. Maybe we should keep moving, Mark, just because we're 40 minutes past. And then folks, if you could keep commenting in the chat, I will keep reading it.
Great. Thanks. Yeah, that was one of the more denser categories. So thanks for adding the additional information and clarifying questions. Here we're looking at transmission impacts or benefits. One being congestion. How does offshore wind either create or relieve congestion? And the way we look at the value of that is really by taking differences in locational marginal price. So this is the price of energy at different points. And when there's a big difference, that means there's a lot of congestion. And so that's kind of the general kind of mechanism we can use to assess that. And then lastly, for transmission is transmission expansion, which can be a large infrastructure investment cost, or potentially transmission upgrade deferrals that potentially adding a new generator at a coastal location may defer transmission upgrades that may have needed to happen anyway. The next category we look at, we label as service continuity. This represents the grid operator's ability to avoid disruptive events such as outages and allows them to respond to them more quickly and easily. So there's kind of two pieces to this. There's reliability, which is the ability for an electricity system to maintain power quality and operation during normal events and common disruptive events. Often these are frequency events, which are generally covered by those grid services we talked to previously. But for this category, we're more looking at continuity of service during or at events that would have been blackouts that are more common on the system. And then the next piece is resilience, which is the ability for electricity system to maintain operations and limit damages from more uncommon stresses. And these could be extreme heat waves, extreme cold temperatures, outages of particular plants, and other events that are kind of unexpected. So Travis has generally kind of talked about a few case studies that illustrate this point, which are kind of the public safety power shutoffs in California, an extreme heat wave that happened actually last summer that caused some additional stresses to the electricity system. And we're trying to understand how and if offshore wind can mediate some of these impacts. Travis, do you want to add anything about this piece?
I seem to be stuck on mute, sorry.
Okay.
I think you did a good job there. I think, yeah, we're kind of interested in, production during times of system stress. There's a bit of a blurred line between this and capacity value for me.
Mm-hmm.
So we need to think about clearly distinguishing reliability, make sure we're not double counting things.
Mm-hmm.
Distinguishing reliability from resilience from capacity credit. So that's all I'll say about that.
All right. If there's no other questions, we can jump to the environmental slide. Here we go. So there's really two pieces that we're thinking about in terms of air emissions. So both criteria air pollutants such as NOx, SOx, and particulate matter, which are regulated by the EPA. And the cost of these emissions can be inferred based on their impacts to human health. And there's regulatory mechanisms in place to reduce their emissions, and traditional thermal generation has abatement technology in place to reduce their emissions. So what we're looking at here is, does offshore wind change the amount of criteria pollutants emitted into the air, and then what's the value based on that? Similarly, we take the same scope with greenhouse gas emissions. And to quantify the value of these components, we would look at the difference between GHG emissions before and after one of the offshore wind scenarios and measure the value of that. Typical metrics usually use the social cost of carbon, and there's guidance from agencies and literature about what value is best to use there. And the last piece, and one that I am probably less familiar with, but we were really happy to have Dan on the team because he's an economist. This last component is really more about financial risk. So oftentimes generators may purchase price hedges to insure themselves against future high price events. So this may be, for example, natural gas generators that purchase future natural gas prices so that they're not, so they don't like, in case natural gas prices go up really high, they don't have to pay those exact prices. They can use some of their hedges to to mitigate those costs. And so when we think about this, including this component in our framework, it's really looking at a broad system scale to see if offshore wind influences the amount of price hedges that need to be placed, and then the value or the cost that's provided towards those hedges. All right, so that's a value stack. It's got a lot of different components, but now we really want to think about how do we actually assign value or cost to those different components in the different offshore wind scenarios we're looking at. So I'm actually going to pass this back to Travis to talk about a few tools that we have available to us and how we can use the results from those different models to investigate our scenarios.
Thanks, Mark.
Travis, this is
Yes.
Jason. Real quick, there's been several people who have joined us as you all have been presenting. Would you take just 1 minute here and provide the context here? Why are we talking about this?
Sure. Yeah, thanks everybody for joining here. Let me just, maybe I can just go up real quick. Back to the very first slide. We're on slide 12 there. So we have a project here that's investigating, that's after resolving a strategy for offshore wind energy development, which maximizes electrical system benefits in Southern Oregon and in the offshore wind zone from Southern Oregon to Northern California, that being approximately Coos Bay down to Eureka. We're doing that over the next 18 months. We will be optimizing generation footprints according to this evaluation methodology, which we're stepping through now. And then we'll be evaluating 3 conceptual transmission scenarios to pull that generation off the ocean and incorporate it into land-based grids. And those scenarios will be guided by input from industry groups such as this one. And Jason has so many groups, I can't keep track of them sometimes, but that's why it's so great for us to have POET as a partner who can help us kind of convene and coalesce the inputs from industry on, what are the most promising alternatives, what are the scenarios of greatest interest to industry. And then once that's done, we'll be applying based on the dispatch work through the production cost model and power flow analysis, we'll be valuing all these components off the generation footprint, and then also evaluating transmission into the Bay Area. So that's kind of the overall, that's the high level 30,000 foot view. That's the project that we've kicked off here, and this is the very first time we've been able to engage with this industry group convened by POET. And today the subject really has to do with this valuation methodology. And so we're stepping through, here's the kind of the summary chart is right here. So we're stepping through this wheel of all these different valuation components, value components. And the idea here is to probe, what is the incurred or avoided cost of an offshore wind generation footprint and transmission of that, and transmission infrastructure associated with that generation footprint at system scale. And also within the bounds of pretty squarely, you'll see what's in and what's out. We're really focusing on grid values. Now, there are a few elements here that might seem not quite grid, and that's maybe the financial risk piece and the environmental. We decided to keep these in because we think there's a really important piece in terms of hedge value, in terms of operation of the markets, operation of the grid, influence of dispatch based on price trends that could be significantly perturbed by offshore wind, maybe in a good way, maybe in a bad way, but this needs to be investigated. And because that affects dispatch. And then the last one would be this environmental piece, which is so fundamental to the transition that current grids are undergoing. And that's relevant, that's been observed in the state policies and federal policies as well. So that includes, of course, carbon, greenhouse gas emissions. We're trying to decarbonize. That's what the policies seek to do, decarbonize the sector. But also, there are also criteria, local air pollutants that come along with that as well. And those improvements have been sought after by federal and state policy also. The other kinds of things like economic development, jobs, viewshed impacts, positive or negative tourism, and any other societal effects pretty squarely outside of the bounds of this exercise. So that's what we're after. Is that a helpful overview, Jason?
Yes, absolutely. And would you be so kind? There are a couple folks on the phone asking if I have a copy of this presentation.
Oh.
It's possible for you to zip that over to me. I will forward it on to these folks.
Yes, I could do that right now. So let me just touch on this one.
Yep.
This one slide that I was on for
When you
Mark.
can do it, that's no
Okay.
problem. Thank you.
And then a question from Cameron in the chat here. Yeah, maybe a quick question just to revisit the future study years and the associated generation portfolio. Yeah, so going back here, so we do seek to evaluate, kind of a future state of the grid in our Oregon study, where Drew was my co-PI. We looked at 2028. To now, what we'll be doing is considering like an early 2030 base case as one of the two future states we'll be looking at. So that'll probably be something like the 2032 anchor data set, which is in work, or there's currently a 2030 anchor data set out of the WEC, which shows, as you might guess, some thermal retirements, some additional variable renewable energy generation. So changes in that way, Cameron, to the generation mix, but then also a more aggressive future state, and that is yet to be established, but could be something that's similar to the 2040 WEC anchor data set. There's been some work out of a WEC study group that is considered a 2040 future state. We're still at the point of reviewing those and understanding which is most appropriate, but it would just be doubling down on that. So even more aggressive. If the 2032 anchor data set is really reflecting IRPs and what's in those utility IRPs, the 2040 or the more aggressive set would go farther than what are currently drafted as a sensitivity, and so that would double all the studies, all the cases we will run, because we'll have another future state.
And Travis, I wanted to follow on and ask a question about that. I think that's there's some critical questions in that.
Mhm.
And I wanted to ask you if you think that's another opportunity to come back and discuss that further as we, as that is developed.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, we will be really leaning on Hitachi Energy, our partner for some of that work. But then we've done work internally to P&L as well. So we would be, the more touch points we can get with this group, the better. I mean, we would love to have another call about that and to discuss the future states. As I mentioned, 2032, we're pretty much locked into that one because there's an anchor data set that we'll be using. But that more aggressive one might be, we can review what's in the 2032 anchor data set for the team here, but the more aggressive one might be a good thing to discuss with this team.
Thank you.
And yes, to Cameron's point, we will certainly value the diversity of generation through the methodology, both technically, technologically, and also geographically. Okay, back to slide 12. Sorry, we're running a little long, guys. Let's try to. So we have this thing called a production cost model, which helps us simulate dispatch of generation resources across the system. And Hitachi is the kind of the production cost model that much of the industry, including system operators, rely upon, is Hitachi's GridView product. So that was one of the reasons why we desired them as a partner, and we're really lucky to have them as part of the team. They'll help us customize the tool. There's some things, some of these valuation components, they already directly support. So, energy value, there's some decarbonization value that's already captured, but generation cost savings, the tool though can also run in a zonal mode. So we can get a capacity value with some work, some customization, but we can get some capacity numbers out of the tool. Some of the grid support, like ramping reserve, things like that. Those that require, of course, power flow studies don't fit into GridView, so there will be different tools that will also be used. And then we'll look at costs over the offshore wind footprints project, assuming a project lifetime of 20 years or maybe longer, and then using detailed data for the Western Interconnect that's in the anchor data set of the WEC. And then we also have another tool to mention is a P&L tool called Graph Plan. This is probably not super interesting to this team, but I'll just say that It allows us to simulate the reserves that are required, particularly for regulation and ramping reserves. So it takes in various weather year data to understand the need for those products across an entire system. So we can model the whole WEC in graph plan. And we can do a kind of a base case without offshore wind, and then with the offshore wind footprint. And underneath each transmission scenario, we can understand, you know, how does that new concept, you know, what is the cost increment? Is it in terms of additional ramping reserves, or is it avoided ramping reserves, for example, or regulation, for example, to help us get a sense for what the system will require to compensate for that resource. All right, and then back to you, Mark.
Excuse me, could I ask a quick question?
Sure.
This is Eric Hale. Do you, in your models that you're producing, do you assume that there's very limited or no storage, energy storage on the grid, so that you're having to dispatch the wind resource in real time?
That's a great question. And I think the way to answer that, we'd have to know for sure what's in that anchor data set. As far as co-located energy storage, for example, if you're thinking of the offshore wind resource, that depends how we model it. So that could be, Eric, that could be one of the transmission scenarios. We could consider energy storage located at the point of interconnection of the offshore wind generators as a way to, increase the decrease congestion and increase the capacity value of that resource. Or there could be storage assets located elsewhere, next to other variable renewable energy generation resources. I don't think there are many of those right now in the model, but it could be that some of them are inserted in that 2032 future state. But I don't believe that was the case in the 2028 anchor data set, just going from memory. Dhruv is on the phone, so I don't know if Dhruv, if you want to speak up, if you know anything about 2032.
Yeah, the 2028 one did not have really, it just had sort of the pump storage that was existing.
Okay.
Maybe a few batteries on the bigger side. I think the 2030 one is also a little limited. It has a little bit more storage, but that's kind of limited to what's installed. I don't know about the 2032. That might be something we can ask Hitachi. But we have some higher sort of storage scenarios from related projects that some of our colleagues are doing that we could also pull in if we wanted to.
Okay. Very interesting. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. And thanks, Dhruv. So Mark, maybe back to you to cover this slide and to bring us home here.
Yeah, we'll just wrap this up quickly by saying there's other tools we'll probably need to use in combination with grid view and graph plan for some of the things that they don't have complete modeling abilities to cover. And that's the piece that we're working through now as a team, is how do we use the models, how do we leverage their results, and how do we build on that to cover all the value components that we want to add. So, and then we have one more slide only that just kind of shows, again, what's outside, what we were considering outside the scope of the framework. Mainly just because we're trying to focus specifically on benefits and impacts to the electricity system rather than the broader societal impacts that are related to the electricity system. So with that, I think it kind of covers everything, but I mean, if we have time, we'll happily take any clarifying or additional questions. And in particular, if you have feedback in terms of what we're including in the value stack. Is there too much? Are there some things that aren't relevant? Are there additional components that we really should be considering and things like that? So yeah, really happy to hear from you.
Mark, this is Jason. So two things. One is, I think we are prepared today to receive your comments. If there's something you want to say today, that's great. Put them in the chat or raise your hand. But let's also talk about a mechanism to collect those comments and present them. So this study is just now launching, and POED has the responsibility of convening and aggregating comments from the larger offshore wind sector, transmission sector. So we've got the industry advisory group, we've got POTS, we have Ford. I'm a member of the Offshore Wind California Trade Group. So we have a few forums here that we can reach out to, and that is the intent to collate that feedback as this study proceeds. So with this group specifically, let us maybe just propose here a straw proposal here of go ahead and send your comments directly to Bill, Henry, or to me, or both, and we'll collect those and make sure that PNNL has. Of course, many of you have a direct relationship with PNNL. I suspect you're happy to pick up the phone and talk with them directly. So does that sound good from the PNNL crew?
It does. It does. And I'll just note, Jason, that Tyler has a hand up.
Yep, see that. Go ahead, Tyler.
Thank you very much. This is a great presentation. Really appreciate the conversation. My question has to do with whether and how you guys will incorporate any of the transmission scenarios that were articulated in the CAISO 20-year transmission plan. And I'm particularly thinking about ones that are kind of proposed for unlocking some of the offshore wind capacity in the Humboldt area.
Yeah, absolutely. Great question. I think, as I mentioned, we haven't decided them yet, Tyler. So, and your input is definitely impactful. And we could certainly look at those that they've mentioned. We're tracking their comments when they think about how to move. You know, I know in their 20-year outlook, you know, they talked about Del Norte and Cape Mendocino in addition to Humboldt. So they're certainly looking up in that area. And those, I think, you know, again, we're looking at footprints down to Humboldt. So I think those others, you know, and the concepts CAISO has brainstormed are certainly relevant. And no, it doesn't need, we don't need to reproduce. I mean, we're not really, again, it's kind of we want to survey the group, and we want to understand what's interesting and relevant from your perspective. We don't necessarily have to reproduce the TPP work, right? But and it might be more interesting not to. But again, if and keep in mind that we're after the sort of optimum electrical system value, which is maybe a little bit different than the take of how wind energy areas are being identified by BOEM, right? So in that, from that, and also by CAISO, I don't know that they're searching for, you know, I'm not sure how they're picking Del Norte and Cape Mendocino, you know, for example, but other than there's good wind resource up there. So all of that, a lot of words to say that I think we have the ability as a team here to decide what are the most useful concepts to consider, and an input could be what CAISO is doing and others.
Okay, thank you. I'll add that in my comments.
Thanks, Tyler. I see Shannon's hand.
Hey, Travis. So on POTS, I actually represent ocean in this conversation, and I love the slide that you have up because it kind of provides a nice visual for exactly the type of socioeconomic analysis and strategy development we've been advocating for. So my question is, do you have an interest in receiving some feedback from the social aspects of the scope that you are of those values, as well as industry input?
Always interested, Shannon. The one thing I will say is that, you know, we're just trying to be really disciplined about which elements we incorporate in this study, and which ones will be incorporated by maybe ourselves and maybe others in future work. So that's why, you know, we've kind of put these aside. But the other social elements, you know, the pollution, you know, contributions, some of the cost elements, you know, those are certainly squarely within the bounds of like that electrical system framing or grid framing. So in terms of, does that help? In terms of this project, I would say, I mean, I'm always interested in the feedback that the work you're doing on ocean, with ocean, and it is certainly relevant to this, you know, societal value kind of roll up. But for this study, I just want to be really clear that for this study, we're really kind of really zoning in on the grid value.
Totally understood. So I mispresented the question then. We'd love to complement our work that is clearly outside of the scope of this study with your work, with those same caps and stuff like that.
I see.
And within the scope of yours, would be happy to provide some feedback, specifically on
Oh, great.
those
Yeah, great.
additional, because we've been very active in the PUC capacity docket on this. So are happy to contribute that way as well.
Okay, that sounds great. That sounds like a way to extend the work. I mean, to kind of cover that, the elements that we're not touching on. So absolutely supportive of that. Thanks, Shannon.
This is Chip. I have a general question. Why are we focusing on the California grid only?
We don't mean to say that. If so we're certainly interested in grids, I mean, in terms of balancing authority areas, Pacific Core West, BPA, the coastal transmission networks in Oregon, and then also PG&E and CAISO. So it's all of those. Chip,
Okay,
sorry if I didn't
sorry.
represent that.
One of the things I think it might be a benefit putting power injection into Southern Oregon may relieve some of the South Boston congestion in the Portland area. And during summer condition, you've got predominantly north-south grid flow.
Yeah, Chip, that is certainly something we would capture. And with that production cost model, for example, yes, that's well in bounds.
And the other thing from a power flow standpoint you need to be cognizant of is Del Norte County is north of the California-Oregon boundary, Humboldt is south. And so there's a big electrical bridge there that has limited capacity. And you'll wind up wreaking havoc potentially on the grid system if you put a parallel path through there.
Which element did you say it was north of?
Well, there's the California-Oregon border,
Yep.
which is and so Del Norte County, Crescent City area connects to the north side of the border.
Yeah, through Pac West.
Which
Yep.
is Humboldt is connected to the south side.
Correct. Yeah.
And so you have to be careful not to try to run a parallel transmission path connecting the two that bypasses the border. You'll wind up with internal overloads.
Okay.
Hey Chip, this is Bill. I think that point there about another parallel path, I think is very important, because I think part and parcel of what we're talking about here is creating a really big parallel path between the Pacific Northwest and California. It's actually one of the objectives of this POTS work group, is to explore that explicitly. So I just wanted to step in and mention that that's what we're going to be looking into. So
yeah, you're probably looking at 500 lines down through the coast.
We may be. That's right.
Yeah, and good luck getting one through the redwoods.
Right. So in the instance at value of time, I think we got one more hand up, Fred, and then we do have another component of the presentation where actually we'll be talking about some of those possible transmission scenarios.
Yeah, and so first, just to say about south of Alston, I was on the Columbia Grid Review Committee for that, and in general, I think that's less of a concern now that the units at Centralia are retiring. First unit's gone, the second one's out in 2025. A lot of the issue there was that there's in the peak summer periods, and this is only an issue in the summer, south of Alston's not a problem in the winter, that there's so much generation north of that constraint that wants to get to Portland or even down to California, that the south of Alston constraint applies. But we've seen less of an issue with that in recent years, actually. And the bigger issue for me, and this was highlighted in the PNNL paper, a year ago, really great paper, is that offshore wind provides energy to the I-5 corridor, basically, the South Coast or Oregon offshore wind, that in effect creates more headroom for resources coming across the Cascades. It relieves some of the congestion, broadly speaking, all the way up and down. And that is really a big deal. So that's the point I would focus on. And I probably we're going to get into this, but there's been significant work now done on the California side on offshore wind, the new CAISO transmission plan, which the comment period just ended yesterday for the draft, has a lot of, I would say, initial analysis of what it would take. They've got multiple different pathways, lots of interesting results there to look at. We haven't seen that yet for the Oregon side, but in some ways it would be, I think, a little easier to construct that next stage assessment on the transmission side. I mean, that's partly what we're here to talk about, obviously. But there is a lot more work that can be done. My general sense is none of this is, we can find ways to do the transmission build out. It will cost a lot of money and take some time. The question is what provides the best overall value and provides both the reliability and economic benefits of the offshore wind and connecting lines.
Thanks, Fred. So with that, if we have any final questions, we can take those. Anyone have any last comment on this? I do have a few slides to show. I think they're an excellent follow-on to this thread to discuss what the structure that this work group could do to try and flesh out some of those transmission scenarios. So with that, I will share my screen or share my presentation.
While Bill's doing that, I'll just note that I just checked the New York Bight sale lease. One of them is still going at $200 million. 5 bidders still going for a lease site.
It's very interesting to see that for the first time myself.
Yeah.
So okay, so the POTS form and the steering committees is going to do the very fast overview of this. And again, this is also a pitch for you all to think about participating and contributing and giving us substantive contributions to this, which is what we're going to need. So I show this slide as kind of a grounding and one of the reasons why we want to pursue shared offshore transmission so that the individual wind farm developers may have a separation actually from taking on some of these larger challenges of building out the electric system to serve them. So geographic focus. We saw from Travis the geographic focus area, and that's kind of echoed in the area that we've really decided that is a critical place to focus. So this chart here is kind of complicated, but it kind of just shows the layout of the area in between the Humboldt Call area down what you see down here, and then Coos Bay up at the very north end of the screen. This is a bathymetric slope chart, showing what the seafloor looks like, and this is where we say the red is bad and green is good here, and so we want to get as much green as possible. So the central area right off the coast of Crescent City, in between approximately Gold Beach and the Humboldt Call area, it looks like a very promising location. There's a lot of positives to it. Also, one of the big positives that it does have a Bonneville transmission corridor that reaches in relatively close proximity to it. And of course, you've got the activities that we've already talked about a little bit going on down in California to connect up into this direction. So very important focus area. And there's also areas that are a little bit further north that we're probably going to learn about on Friday from BOEM, where these areas are. But regardless of what BOEM releases, we do think that this central area, which we're calling the larger Del Norte area, which does extend up into Oregon, it's also Oregon and California, is going to be a very important one. And it kind of lends itself geographically to this idea of a offshore backbone system, so an offshore grid. And we're really happy to see that the CAISO did give an initial indication that that could be important. So we're gonna try and help think through how we can plan some of these aspects. So this chart here shows a little bit more about some of the planning participants that might get involved. You've got this central area here, this larger Del Norte area, CAISO planning region, Pacific Power, Bonneville, and then there might be other parties in the Pacific Northwest that clearly have an interest in transmission. And one thing that we want to be really clear about from the very beginning here is that any activities that we are seeking to pursue around planning for this larger opportunity here, the larger Del Norte area, we want to make sure that any projects that may be planning and in development on an earlier timeline than this larger opportunity are that the path is completely clear for them, and that all the work that we're doing is improving the prospects for those early projects to come online as soon as they can. So here's a little overview of these two subcommittees that we're proposing. There's a technology subcommittee and a business model subcommittee. So, and this is just an initial framework for how we're proposing to do this, and we're open to feedback on it. But POET would introduce high-level design objectives, and this technology and design subcommittee would look at those factors and actually create a straw concept that's responsive to what's physically out there, and that gets to some of those critical factors about what's on the seafloor and where it makes sense to build facilities and where it might not. And then the business model subcommittee will take some of those recommendations and evaluate them on, from the perspective of whether or not there's any means to commercially advance any of these projects. And we may need to iterate there if we come up with, projects that have no commercial, pathway forward, because we want to make sure that the types of concepts that we're bringing forth have a prospect of advancement beyond this committee. And that's actually the purpose of this, is to advance these concepts once we've vetted them to a certain extent. And this way we can advance these to other planning venues. We'll talk more about that in the next slide.
And Bill, you got a question from Aaron Porter. On the prior slide, what bottom slope was categorized as red?
So we'll go back up. So this mapping tool kind of has a somewhat of a rough categorization of green, relatively flat, yellow in the middle, and red is steep. Is relatively steep. There's a lot more information that we need other than that. This is just a very early indication of these things, and we should be really cautious not to read too much into this, and meaning that there is absolutely no reason to say that you could not develop on areas that are red. What we're saying here is that the areas that are wide open green might logically be an area where a developer might express more interest. Hopefully that provides a little more context.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so here is an example of one of the representations that we could do for the concepts that we could come up with and a bit of the process. So if POET suggests with your feedback, some possible requirements to interconnect a certain quantity of offshore wind at a certain location, which is to say, it could be some quantity of offshore wind at one location, some quantity at another. And this business model subcommittee reviews and maybe revises that. This sets forth the requirements that then our technology design subcommittee would begin to suggest solutions for what those could be. And I'll put up another map here that shows one possible concept that could be advanced, and then our business model subcommittee would review that and revise that. And then it would be advanced to our steering committee, which would decide whether or not it would make sense to forward one of these concepts or multiple of these concepts that we come up with to external planning entities or planning organizations. And there are several possibilities here. Clearly we're going to have a really positive interaction with the PNNL study that's currently going on, but I've listed some other ones here that might be important activities that are going on in transmission planning. The Department of Defense and California Energy Commission has a study that is going to get started at some point. I'm not really sure when. There's U.S. Department of Energy and BOEM has offshore wind convening that will have certain planning activities, and we don't know the exactly how that's going to work on the West Coast, but we do expect we might be getting an update on that in 6 months or so, maybe not, or sometime in that range. We've also got the CAISO transmission and planning process, which we've heard about. The poet submitted comments into the CAISO 20-year outlook process. And in those comments, we said that in the future, we would likely have additional comments for future transmission planning processes. And of course, you've got Bonneville, Northern Grid, and in addition, you also have investor-owned utilities that have components of transmission planning in their IRPs. And of course, Fred is mentioning in the chat here that WEC should be on this list, and I completely agree with that. So that's just a brief overview, and I want to go back to this slide real quick. And I want to mention that this representation here is just showing how these things could be communicated. I'm absolutely not trying to suggest that this is the correct approach or anything like that. It's just one of the ways it can be communicated. But I will add that these two 500 kV lines on this chart from CAISO up to the Humboldt area are consistent with what we saw from the CAISO TPP for what they suggested could be a correct build out for the 1.6 gigawatt Humboldt call area, which is on this map, is right down here. So this whole the part about this large parallel path, I do think some of the pieces are emerging to dig into that a little bit further. So with that, we'll just leave it for any comments or discussion. I know we're pretty close to the end of the meeting.
Will you be sharing this PowerPoint that you just did?
Yes, we will be. That will be posted on the POTS website.
Thank you.
And so, question from Chip: has an HVDC system been considered? And the answer to that, Chip, is we haven't considered anything yet. That, I think, that is the purpose of these subcommittees, is to entertain suggestions and engage in a discussion about whether or not those types of things make sense to advance into a more detailed study process. And then Fred, got your hand up.
Yeah, just to follow up on that. So there's quite a bit of discussion in the CAISO TPP, and I'll put the link in the chat here, about different aspects of HVDC. They have looked at some options, begun looking at some options for both offshore and onshore HVDC to deal with offshore wind. So, there is a fair bit to chew on that. And a number of us have been thinking a lot about the idea of using HVDC as a kind of a connector between different offshore wind regions on the West Coast, and also for reliability purposes. So, it's a broader discussion even than just offshore wind offtake, to get it into the mainland.
Yeah, thanks, Fred. I think there may even be another, value stream when we talk about HVDC is in the controllability and being able to change, explicitly adjust power flows in ways you can't do with the AC system. So that could even be something we talk about, in this evaluation methodology. Okay, so any more, comments and questions? We want to, make a pitch to, everyone on this call that if you'd like to participate in these subcommittees and provide your input, that's the purpose of why we're here.
Bill, I might just pose a question if I may. Hi, everybody. This is Troy Gagliano with Portland General Electric. And this is just kind of that, an outside the box thinking question. Is there any conversation or role thus far for possible merchant transmission being involved? That's kind of anathema to the Pacific Northwest, but it happens in lots of other regions with really different markets, of course. But just since this is such a fascinating and large puzzle, are we thinking about that element of the puzzle maybe?
So, yes, I've thought about it, but, I don't think that we really have any, set in stone concepts about what the commercial, path forward is. So to answer that, what I'd say is, please join our business model subcommittee for pods that we can talk about, merchant transmission and other types of transmission business models to build some of these things. Because in the end, POET's goal here is to advance offshore wind in large quantities. And we would really like to hear what parties' thoughts are and the best way to do that.
Thank you. Agreed. David Nightingale has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks very much. I'm obviously new to this group, but I just want to say that my aim is going in participating with this group and affiliated groups is to extend this up into the Washington Southern Coast, but I think it's a West Coast wide thing. So I understand the box you're constraining yourself to right now. And so I'm, I guess, looking for ways to add to that with weight from Washington State as well as Oregon, and also help develop momentum politically on the industry side, whatever, to help make that happen.
David, thank you for that. I'm delighted that you're here today. As you know, we've talked about this in the past. The interest from Washington has been almost nil up to about a year or so ago, but things are starting to evolve, and so I think your point is a good one and timely. We definitely need to be thinking about this resource regionally. So I appreciate your comment and your participation.
Yeah, again, thanks for that, David. I think that this initiative really is focused on the 3 West Coast states, because this is something that reaches up and down the Western power system. The way I'm looking at it, anyway. All right. Well, with that, we are at time. So I'll hand it back to Jason if he wants to make any final comments. But you'll be hearing from us with some of the opportunities to comment on what P&L shared and what our next steps are going to be.
Right. Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you, Bill, and thank you, Travis and Mark. As excellent presentation, very informative. And following up on this, just a couple points, and I'll let you go. One is there is the Happy Gigawatt Hour that we have planned for tomorrow evening between 5 and 7 at the Lucky Lab off of Hawthorne. Secondly, we will be sending out these presentations. And third, I think as part of those sending out those, we'll remind you that we are, feel free to use that email as a mechanism to respond regarding comments on the PNL materials. We'll be happy to take those comments and get them onto PNL. So thanks everyone for participating. Any final comments, questions before we finish today's meeting? All right, well, let's look forward to seeing some of you tomorrow evening, and very excited to see what happens on Friday when we see the first draft call areas. Just so everyone knows, once those call areas are made public, they will, BOEM will take, I think they said between, a couple of weeks, give or take, before those will actually show up in the Federal Register, which will actually be the quote call for information and nominations. There'll be, I think, a 60-day comment period on that, which is a little bit longer than what happened in California, but I think they're going to go with a little bit longer public comment period. And then, changes can be made to them. They can be expanded, they can be reduced. If they're expanded, there'll have to be another call. But if they're reduced, they can proceed. And we're on track for leases in 2023. So with that, I'll finish, and thank you all very much. Last comment in the chat. Yep. All right. Thank you all very much, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Stay safe.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Bill.
Yeah.
Thank you, Travis. Thank you, Mark.
Hey,
Ken?
this is for anyone who's still on the line. I'm thinking about our conversation with Governor Brown on Friday. And one of Poet's suggestions for her was to elevate the collaboration of the Pacific States Collaborative around offshore wind planning. So I'm very interested in pulling this scope up into that so we can complement that in their work too. I'm wondering, when is this work product due? What's the timeline on this? Can you remind me?
Travis, can you answer that? If you're
Oh,
so
is it a question for me? Sorry, Shannon. I would say, we'll be doing reports of the full project by the summer of 23.
Okay. Well, let's connect and see if perhaps there are some milestones and opportunities that we can leverage around. Exciting.
Yeah, let me know if you need any detail. I presented some of those milestones on the CEC call in a very compressed amount of time, but if you needed, specific milestones and when they might come out before the final report, then I can give you that.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay.
Right on. Well, thank you all. And we'll hopefully we'll see some of you tomorrow evening. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Jason.
Bill. You're welcome. Very welcome. Bye-bye.